and it is with great pride and pleasure that I give you Mr. Harry Kunzru.
President, Provost, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor to be asked to come and speak to you here today. And I hope I'm not going to do too much of telling you things you don't want to hear. And I'd like to thank you for that honor, and I'd like to thank Dr. Rashid Nath and clearly his sister for making this happen. It's an amazing story. That was an extraordinary story, and it's a story that couldn't have taken place until now, really. I mean, that's the kind of chain of events of somebody Googling something that didn't even make sense to them and just leading to me being here today. It's a beautiful story. Being a writer is, among other things, being a researcher, and you really have only two topics: yourself and the world. It's a kind of self-directed program where almost anything that happens to you and everything that you are can kind of be folded into the work that you're making. And I mean, I'm sure that's actually the case, is that the question to the student researchers suggested that for everybody's research, there's got to be that element of discovering something about yourself and something personal and immediate. But, and what I do, that's all there is, really. It's that kind of excavation and that kind of work is the basis of what you do as a fiction writer. The title I gave to this talk is perhaps a little mysterious at the outset. Whoever brought me here will have to get me home. And it's a title drawn from the 13th century Persian Sufi mystic poet Rumi. And it's a strikingly modern poem, the poem that this is taken from. And he compares himself to a drunk who wakes up in a strange tavern, a strange bar, and has no idea how he came to be in this place. And I'll read you the poem. It's very beautiful, and it's extraordinary to me that this is 800 years old. It's in a translation by a guy called Coleman Barks. All day I think about it. Then at night I say it. Where did I come from? And what am I supposed to be doing? I have no idea. My soul is from elsewhere, I'm sure of that, and I intend to end up there. This drunkenness began in some other tavern. When I get back around to that place, I will be completely sober. Meanwhile, I'm like a bird from another continent, sitting in this aviary. The day is coming when I fly off, but who is it now in my ear who hears my voice? Who says words with my mouth? Who looks out with my eyes? What is the soul? I cannot stop asking. If I could taste one sip of an answer, if I could break out of this prison for drunks. I didn't come here of my own accord. I can't leave that way. Whoever brought me here will have to take me home. This poetry, I never know what I'm going to say. I don't plan it. When I'm outside the saying of it, I get very quiet and rarely speak at all. I think this is the same for all of us. We're thrown into the world. We arrive in the middle of things with no idea how we got here and no control over the situation. This is true for everyone, but it's particularly true for young people, and I think doubly true for young people who have some history of migration in their families. I mean, I'm a migrant. I was born in London and I've come to live in New York, but that's something that's happened to me quite recently. I've been here 4 years. But I remember this idea of thrownness, of being thrown into the middle of things, being the dominant theme of my childhood. And I think it's the reason that I became a writer. I suppose I should say something about my childhood. My father is from India. He's from, as the introducer said, a Kashmiri Pandit family, a Hindu family from the far north of India. My mom is English. My dad came to London to work as a doctor back in the 60s, and he met my mom, who was a nurse on the ward, and they got together. And this, at the time, this was a very unusual and possibly transgressive thing to do. the families on both sides were very, very nervous. And in fact, my Indian family refused to speak to my parents until I was about 2 years old, when they, I like to think, as a result of a rather beautiful baby picture of me, were reconciled to this unusual family. And I remember my mom tells a story of being taken by her dad, her stepdad, in fact, for a little walk in the garden after they announced that they were going to get married, and they said, well, we like Ravi, we think he's a great guy, he's a doctor, who doesn't want their daughter to marry a doctor? But how will you feel pushing a little brown baby around in a pram? And my mum was shocked by that. It just had not even occurred to her that other people would have a problem with this. But in London in the 60s, in England in the 60s, though, race was a real issue. I have a brother. My mum and dad had 2 kids. He got all the English names. He's called Richard William Philip. It's like all the members of the royal family all in one. And Richard looks English. You would not pick him out as an Indian kid at all. Whereas I look much more Indian. And sometimes we would be, I don't know, in some public place as kids, and people would ask which one of us was adopted. And that was a very, very weird experience for me. And a lot of the things that happened to me as a kid kind of got wrapped up in a single question that would get asked to me again and again by well-meaning adults who just wanted to start a conversation with the little boy in the dentist waiting room or wherever. Lean down and they say, "Where are you from?" And I'd be like, "What do you talk about?" I'd say, "Well, Woodford," which was the name of the suburb where I grew up. And then they say, no, where are you from? And as I got a little bit older, I realized that what they were really asking was, who had sex to make you? And I grew to resent that. I was like, well, why should I have to justify myself? Why should I be some kind of problem in need of a solution? And that feeling of being a problem, that feeling of things not being 100% fixed and obvious, was, I think, what started me on the road to doing what I do today, which is writing stories. Because if the world seems straightforward to you, there's no need to make art about it. If you feel like you're at the center of your life and you can just get on with it. You only make art when there's a question, when there's something you can't get a grip on. I often say that a novel is a question that you haven't actually worked out how to ask. And you have to go through the process of writing and making a story and this big commitment of spending a couple of years making a piece of writing in order to actually frame the question, let alone trying to find an answer. When I'm writing, I often have a sense that there's a bunch of things that go together, but I'm not sure why and I'm not sure how. And the work that gets done, the research that I do, the other kind of work that I do to make a novel is trying to excavate why these things feel connected to me. So I mean, this fact of race was probably the dominant fact of my childhood, and I have no idea how it is for you guys, but maybe there are things that you can connect to with this. I mean, when I was a kid, in London they used to use the word mixed race about me, as if there were 2 things that had been blended together like a smoothie. And there were other words too, nasty words, some of them. They used to use the word half-caste, which is, the general idea was that there was something pure, and then there was people like me. And as I got older, the idea of multiculturalism became a thing in Britain, and actually being multicultural, being this kind of smoothie person, was kind of cool. And people would sometimes say to me, how nice it is for you, how great, how lucky you are to have 2 cultures. As if I had 2 sets of books to read from, with 2 languages, 2 sets of recipes, 2 types of music, 2 kind of sets of ethnic clothes that I could wear to festivals. And yet still there was this idea that I was somehow split, that I needed something to make me whole. And it was this, this idea of not being kind of complete and whole used to kind of follow me around a lot. It amazes me in some ways that we still talk about race You know, race is a 19th century idea. It's a set of what people call folk taxonomies. You know, we think we know more or less what we mean when we say black, Asian, white, whatever. But when we examine these categories closely, they get really fuzzy around the edges. What's biology? What's culture? What's the difference between me and my brother Richard? Richard, who looks like an English guy, and I look, I don't know, people guess Spanish, Israeli. You know, we never thought at home that it was strange to have an Indian dad and an English mum. And it was always out on the street that became an issue, and that became something that people commented on. You know, in the 1980s, London was quite a tense place. Even in the suburbs where I was growing up, which was a very sort of dominantly white place and quite a wealthy place, there were real kind of proper old school fascists around. There were skinheads of the National Front. And so I grew up being very aware of this thing, about this race thing, about color. And in Europe, the idea of race always gets linked to the idea of home. And in the US, you talk about Homeland Security. And that is a phrase that I've always hated. I can stand up here and say that homeland, this word homeland, feels to me a very loaded word. You know, in the 19th century, there was a theory that particular races belonged in particular places, that kind of organic or natural nations were ones where the people and the land were somehow one. You know, in Nazi Germany, of course, this gave rise to some pretty dubious ideas about the Jews who weren't at home, who were people without a land, who were rootless, who were messing up this pure correspondence between people and land, people and homeland. So the idea of Homeland Security always carries kind of a bad vibe for me. And I always laugh at that T-shirt that you see being sold in various places downtown with a group of Native American warriors looking extremely tough on it, and it says, you know, Homeland Security since 1492. That seems like a good gag to me, because that asks the question about who is really at home in this nation where we've all come from other places, voluntarily, involuntarily. You know, so at a certain idea, and I think it was the crucial moment for me in becoming a writer and actually knowing how to find my orientation in this kind of group of ideas which I'd been thrown in the middle of, was to decide to make the idea of my own rootlessness and my homelessness into a positive thing. To actually say that, to refuse the idea of being split and to refuse the idea of being somehow less because I didn't have an organic connection to a particular place or a particular culture. The very fact that I was able to invent myself, to take things from different places, to create myself could be a really, really positive thing. And it's that work is a lot of what I did in my first published novel, The Impressionist. The title, The Impressionist, is exactly what it sounds like. It's a guy who does impressions. It's a character who puts on voices, who does characters. He's somebody he's a kid. The book's set in the 1920s, and he's a kid who grows up into a very wealthy, high-caste Indian family, Hindu family, who are very proud of the fact that he has extremely pale skin. They see that as a sign of good breeding, as a sign of purity and perfection. And as it turns out, his mother actually had sex with an Englishman, and he is impure in precisely the way that I was supposed to be impure. His family kick him out. It's a kind of big, unlikely, picaresque fable, this story. This kid, who is Pranath, named after Rishi's dad, ends up on the streets in Bombay, and he learns how to act like English people. He learns to do the voices, to behave in certain ways, to dress in certain ways, to kind of create the impression of being one of the colonial elite, one of the ruling caste. And so I sent him on this kind of odyssey around the empire, the British Empire of the 1920s, and it was a way of me having a little dig at all these categories, all these taxonomies that I'd grown up with. As I said, you know, in the atmosphere of 80s London, where I was growing up, the business of race and politics was very present, and it was being played for high stakes, you know, and it was something that you were aware of as a young kid. I remember being aware of it before I was 10, I mean, I think the foundational political moment for me in my life was watching a safari program. I was watching a TV show with lions and giraffes and looking at this picture of this beautiful game reserve and thinking, that looks like the coolest place. And I turned to my mum and dad and said, we should go to South Africa. It would be really good to go and have a vacation in South Africa. And my parents explained to me that we couldn't go to South Africa as a family because we wouldn't be allowed to stay in the same places. We wouldn't be allowed to, because it was the period of apartheid where Indians were not supposed to be in the same kind of hotels and the same, let alone being in a kind of fancy game reserve with white people. And that was incredibly shocking to me. The idea that there was a place in the world where my family was illegal, like to be ourselves was illegal, that was incredible. And then the double whammy came with the discovery that the government of the day in Britain was supporting that apartheid government. The Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher was quite a although they nominally opposed apartheid as a policy, they did a lot of things to prop up the South African government. And, well, that was me done, basically. I realized at that point that maybe the government isn't always acting in my best interests, and that if they're not acting in my best interest, I need to protect myself, and I need to be together with other people who respect the things that I do. And that sort of shock as quite a small child really led me to asking a lot of critical questions about the society I grew up in, and to make a habit of asking those questions, which is a habit that I retain for good or ill to this day. And in the introduction, you heard a little bit about the novel My Revolutions, which is all set in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And as a kid, I grew fascinated by this moment, two generations previous to mine, where it seemed that there might be a complete social transformation, and that transformation would be led by the young. What an incredible thing to be part of. What an incredibly tantalizing possibility that seemed to me. And my particular generation and the place where I was quite a conservative moment. It wasn't a moment where it looked like we were going to overturn the power structure and have things our way. And so for a long time, I was fascinated by how real these stories about 60s revolution were or weren't. And eventually, that led me to a program of research to actually trying to untangle myth from reality and to try and imagine my way back into the mind of somebody who was politically committed at that moment and who made, crucially, the decision to use violence in support of his political aims. This is the line which is the hardest and most sort of controversial line to cross. When do you use force against established power? And that was what I wanted to think about in this novel. And because it was distant from me, because it wasn't my own experience, this was, in a way, it made it easier to talk through all these difficult ideas without becoming uncomplicatedly identified with them. And that's one thing the novel can do, is to allow you to rehearse difficult, dangerous, controversial ideas without getting mixed up in them or without getting identified with them in an uncomplicated way. And of course, we're now, with Occupy Wall Street and various similar things, we're going through a moment where the young are once again taking the lead in a kind of oppositional politics, and where a lot of questions are being asked. And of course, the main concern of the day today, here in New York, here in America, and around the world, is inequality. I found some figures in I think it's the new issue of the New Yorker, if you ever see the New Yorker. It's taken from a book by a guy called Timothy Noah, The Great Divergence, America's Growing Inequality Crisis and What We Can Do About It. And these figures I found genuinely shocking. Now, in 1979, members of the top 1% of US society took home about 9% of total personal income. Now they take home a quarter. The top 1/10 of that 1% take home 10% of all the income generated in this country. And the top 100th of 1% take home 5% of all the income generated in this country. Now, and of course, as we know, the Great Recession that started in 2008 was felt most severely by those at the bottom. But when the recovery came around in 2010, 93% of the gains, 93% of the money that was, the profit that was made that year went to that top 1%. And there's no question that this is real. The only question is what to do about it. And in that lies all the big political questions of our time. What's an appropriate reaction to this inequality? What effect does such inequality have? Is it something we should say is important and necessary? Or would we have to sacrifice too much in the way of personal liberty in order to redistribute wealth? These are all the questions that are circling around for everybody. You know, I've made clear in public that I am in support of the Occupy Wall Street movement. That's the position that I've taken, because I believe that society functions better when hierarchies are flatter and when inequality is lessened. I mean, I know there are other people maybe in this room who would disagree with that position. And as a novelist, as a maker of art, I think there's something that I can do to elucidate these questions and to help people frame them in their minds. You know, Joseph Beuys, the famous German artist, wrote, "Art that cannot shape society and therefore can't penetrate to the heart the questions of society, and in the end influence the question of capital, is no art." I mean, that's a very controversial definition of art. It's not one that everybody would recognize or even would say is the purpose of art at all. But I believe certainly that it's one of the jobs that as artists we can do is to penetrate to the heart of these social questions and open them up and make them visible for people. I mean, how I became a writer, this is the third and sort of last section of this little speech, brings me back, in fact, to this business about Google and the internet. I mean, my route towards being a novelist and being somebody who could actually make a living telling stories is a funny one. I studied English literature as an undergraduate student, and then I left with this keen desire to try and write fiction, and absolutely no clue how to go about it, and no connections to the publishing industry, very little in the way of work experience. I'd done kind of restaurant jobs and I did driving jobs and things like that, but nothing that had any relevance to my wished for profession. I ended up doing what a lot of people did in those days in England, which was going on the dole. I mean, there was a saying around in the 90s that the dole was really the biggest art subsidy that the government were offering. And in a funny way, that's true. A lot of people who later became part of the cultural renaissance of Britain that was very celebrated had a few years of kind of being very marginal back at that time. But I ended up eventually deciding that I needed to get my act together and that I should try and do something practical. So I went back to school to study philosophy. It shows how worldly I was. And I went and did a master's degree in philosophy and literature, and I was supposed to be thinking about poetry, and I was supposed to be thinking about the philosophical roots of language. But down the hall there were these guys who were fooling around with artificial intelligence. And they were using this thing, the internet, which I had not come across before. This is 1992, before the net was even on the horizon of most people who were actually outside the computer science community. And to me, with my humanities, kind of English literature background, this was supposed to be the boring stuff. This was science stuff. You know what I mean? Dealing with the science stuff. And actually, it's a revelation to me that this was so much more interesting than talking about German Romanticism. This was really where what I wanted to think about, because it seemed on the verge of transforming everything. So I started fooling around with the net. I got an email address, which was kind of an esoteric and unusual thing at that time. And I also really discovered in my heart of hearts that I didn't want to be an academic philosopher. But but I wanted to make my living by writing, and so I ended up getting kind of spat out at the other end of this master's degree. I finished school, I got this degree, and then went back to London, thinking, right, I'm going to have to try and maybe be a freelance writer of some kind, a journalist. And I thought, well, I'd like to write book reviews or be a theatre critic or something, arts and humanities. And actually, as it turned out, the only marketable skill I had was knowing about the internet. And that's what happened for the rest of my 20s. I ended up being a net journalist for various publications. And the first proper job I had was a magazine called Wired, a San Francisco-based magazine. And that was actually how I first started coming to the States regularly, was to visit the offices of this magazine in San Francisco and to kind of get a ringside seat at what turned out to be the first sort of booming of the net. And to this day, I retain a great fascination and interest in this, and also a real interest in the notion that to be good artists, we need to know about science, and we need to know about technology, because science and technology transform the society that we're attempting to understand and describe and respond to. And it always amazes me that there's such a kind of cultural divide between the artist and the scientist. I mean, I have to say, to be a good scientist, you should be something of an artist as well. I think that's a true thing. The kind of original thought and the kind of leaps of imagination in research that go on in good science is it's a two-way process. And here we are in, many years after I was first hearing that kind of sound of the modem, the dial-up modem, crunching through at a 14.4 bit rate. When the web page used to take kind of 5 minutes to come down, and there was this excitement about what would actually be revealed. Now in my pocket I have a phone that could do things that 25-year-old me would have thought was basically science fiction. And all these things fold in together. I mean, everything seems to be connected to everything else. That's the big cliche of cyberspace, and the big cliche of life in a globalized society. And for me, the political questions that I care about fold into the technological questions. There's privacy, surveillance, data collection. All these technologies of control are very important and should be addressed politically as well as technologically. You could say that the Nazis got together the Holocaust and the terrible events of World War II with technology no more advanced than the railway system and IBM adding machines. And you think of the kinds of technologies for gathering data about people that we have, and moving people around and controlling them that we have now. And if we create a society which has the potential for totalitarianism, then the kind of totalitarianism that will be born out of it will be like nothing we've ever seen on Earth. And these are questions that I feel that it's incumbent on all of us, whatever discipline we're in, whatever kind of work we do, to think about and to address. And this is the world that we're thrown into the middle of today. This is the situation that we find ourselves in, wherever we've come from before. Here we are in the middle of this highly networked, fast-paced, globalized world. And the same thing is true as it's always been true, is that whoever got us here will have to get us home. Thank you very much.